One thing most of us can agree on is that animals make life far more interesting. From pets to pests, wild encounters to farmyard mishaps. We all have stories that involve interactions with animals. I'm personally obsessed with reading news stories, and when a headline comes up involving one of these crazy encounters, I have to read it. In today's video, I'm going to tell you about 5 wildlife encounters that made international headlines. We'll look at strange animal attacks, solve the mystery of lizards dropping from the sky, and hear some uplifting stories about how animals and humans have helped each other out. Welcome back to All About Nature. On my channel, I try to make nature-related content that's entertaining and educational. If you like this kind of content, then please help me out by hitting the like button, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. My hope is to get to 5,000 subscribers by the end of the month. It's not likely, but you never know. And if you want to help me out with the production of these videos, check out my Patreon in the video description below. I really appreciate your support. This video idea actually came to me while I was binging my news apps. A story on the BBC caught my eye for its insane headline about a woman being injured by a snake in Texas. And the story was one of the strangest I've ever read. Peggy Jones is a 65-year-old woman who lives in the small town of Silsbee, Texas. It was a hot July day, and Peggy had decided it was a good day to get out in the yard and get some mowing done. As she was mowing her lawn, something extremely strange happened. A snake fell out of the sky and landed on her arm. She was confused about where the snake had come from. She wasn't standing under any trees, but rather in an open area of her yard. She also hadn't seen the lawnmower kick anything up. The snake began to wrap around her arm, and as it did, it also began to bite her repeatedly in the face. In fact, she was bitten so aggressively that the snake actually damaged her glasses. As this was going on, Peggy desperately tried to fling the snake from her arm, but it just continued to bite her. This was when the thought crossed her mind about the snake's origin. Perhaps it was dropped from the sky by a passing bird of prey that had previously captured it. No sooner had the thought crossed her mind when a hawk came flying down to take back its lunch. But because the snake was holding onto her arm, the hawk was unable to get away with its prize. As it kept attempting to get a hold of the snake, it inevitably ended up digging its talons deep into Peggy's arm, even as all the flinging and face biting was taking place. While the entire encounter likely lasted less than a minute or two, by the time the hawk had managed to get a hold of the snake again and fly away, Peggy was left quite injured. She had bite wounds to her face, bruises, puncture wounds, and scratches on her arm, and was left quite traumatized by the entire event. In the moment, she says she feared for her life, and in subsequent interviews, she said that she had trouble sleeping in the ensuing weeks. Speaking of reptiles falling from the sky, for many years in southern Florida, a strange headline has intrigued readers. Beware of falling iguanas. Through the winter months, green iguanas seemingly fall from trees en masse. They're found motionless, and many assume they're dead. But the reality is a little more complicated than that. Florida is one of the warmest states in the US, but it isn't quite tropical. In order to be considered tropical, a location must be close to the equator, falling between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Because southern Florida is just outside of this area by only a few degrees, it's considered subtropical. Because of its relatively warm weather, the state has a high diversity of reptiles which rely on the heat to survive. On top of this, Florida is known for the huge numbers of introduced reptile species it supports, ranging from boas, anacondas, and pythons to chameleons, monitors, and iguanas. In fact, the state has 3 established species of introduced iguanas: Mexican spiny-tails, black spiny-tails, and green iguanas. Green iguanas began to take over some parts of southern Florida beginning in the 1960s, when it's believed they came over on cargo boats from Cuba. Despite the fact that they're a tropical species, they've done relatively well in the state. Today, there are an estimated 40,000 green iguanas in Florida. Like all reptiles, green iguanas are cold-blooded and so have certain temperature requirements to remain active. Once the temperature gets below 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit for an extended period of time, the lizards can fall into a state of torpor called brumation, in which their body systems slow down and the reptile stops responding to most stimuli. In Florida, the winters generally remain warm enough for the iguanas, but on the rare occasion, they get a cold snap. This leads the lizards to fall into brumation, and as they do, they drop from the trees. Wildlife biologists recommend that if iguanas are found in this state, they should simply be moved somewhere safe, where they won't get run over or stepped on. Once the temperatures warm up again, the iguanas will be fine and go back to life as normal. It was a beautiful morning in Singapore when a British citizen named Graham George Spencer decided to go for a walk near the famous Singapore Botanic Gardens. Singapore is a tiny city-state located between Malaysia and Indonesia and is famous for its diverse population, unique development, and strong economy. It's also among the most developed nations in Asia. But this massive economic growth came at a cost. As the country developed, the waterways were polluted, killing off much of the wildlife on the island. But in recent years, restorative work has been done by conservationists, and several species returned to Singapore. One animal to return to the city-state is the river otter. The river otters of Singapore are divided into 10 families, and each have a specific territory within the city. At the Botanic Gardens, the Zouk family are the resident otters. This family is one of the largest, with about 20 members. And as Graham George Spencer made his way towards the entrance of the gardens, he was going to have an encounter with this family that he would never forget. Up ahead of him, crossing the path, was the Zouk family. Graham stopped to admire them as the gregarious animals passed by. But another man was on the path that morning, and he was not as aware of his surroundings as Graham was. As he jogged by, he spooked the otters, and they went into a rage. The jogger was able to avoid them, but Graham wasn't so lucky. The entire group surrounded him and attacked. They began by biting his ankles and legs, but when he fell to the ground, they also managed to bite him on the buttocks and hands. In no more than 10 seconds, he was bitten 26 times. Thankfully, he wasn't walking alone that morning. His friend, who was only a few paces away, managed to scare the otters off and get him to a nearby hospital. He racked up over $1,000 in hospital bills, but his wounds were treated and he was given preventative medication to avoid potential infection. Just like the story of Peggy Jones, Graham said he feared he wasn't going to survive the attack. Wildlife experts believe that the otters thought they were being attacked and, due to the poor lighting of the early morning hours, reacted out of fear and confusion rather than aggression. On October 30th, 2004, Rob House, his 15-year-old daughter, and 2 other girls headed to Ocean Beach, near the town of Whangarei on New Zealand's North Island. Rob House worked as a lifeguard and lifeguard instructor. The group was going to do some training and headed out into the water. When they got about 100 meters from the shore, something strange happened. A pod of dolphins rapidly approached them. Rob was scared. He feared that the dolphins meant them harm, perhaps being a group of aggressive males, or a family protecting a baby. But when the dolphins got to them, instead of attacking, they began a strange behavior. The pod circled the swimmers at close proximity. In fact, they were only centimeters away from the swimmers for much of the encounter. As they swam, they slapped their tails on the surface of the water. This wasn't a quick encounter. The 4 swimmers found themselves trapped by the dolphins for as much as 40 minutes. Whenever they tried to break away from the dolphins, they were corralled back in. Eventually, Rob got his chance, and seeing a break in the pod, he swam away from the girls. As he did so, he noticed that one of the larger dolphins broke away too. As Rob put his face underwater to see where the dolphin was, he saw something shocking below him. A huge great white shark was only a couple of meters away. Confused by all the commotion and noise, the shark didn't attack, but instead stayed near the bottom, trying to figure out what was going on. Eventually, a passing boat came to pick them up, scaring away the shark and the dolphins. This is not a lone incident. There are multiple documented cases of dolphins protecting swimmers, especially from sharks. And the circling behavior is one used by dolphins to protect their own young. East of Tonga in the South Pacific lies the tiny island nation of Niue. It's the westernmost of the Cook Islands and has political affiliation with New Zealand. This tiny island is only 260 square kilometers. Due to its isolation and small size, it doesn't have many native land animals. The majority of the island's fauna is comprised of sea life, though there are several species of terrestrial animals that call the island home, primarily birds, reptiles, and bats. But the island has no rivers, streams, lakes, or ponds. As such, there are no ducks on the island. Or at least there weren't. But that changed in January of 2018. A huge storm blew through the South Pacific, and somehow a lone male mallard got swept out to sea and ended up landing on the tiny island. Because there were no bodies of water for him to live in, he settled for a small puddle on the side of the road. No one is sure where the duck came from, but most likely he was blown over from New Zealand or Tonga. Soon after his arrival, locals began to notice his presence. They had never seen a wild duck on the island before. At some point, he was given the name Trevor Mallard, and Trevor didn't waste any time figuring out a system. He flew around to gardens of nearby houses and quickly learned that the people who lived there would happily give him food when he stopped by. Once word got out about the strange new islander, people began to pass by his puddle and make sure he had something to eat. On occasion, the puddle would dry up, but as his popularity grew, the locals would stop by with water, and even the fire brigade would come and fill up the puddle for him. He even befriended several other animals on Niue, including some chickens and a weka. But 1 year later, in January 2019, locals noticed that Trevor hadn't been seen. In a post on his Facebook fan page, locals all confirmed they hadn't seen him either. Only a couple of days later, Trevor was found in some bushes and had sadly been killed by a dog. Despite the sad ending for Trevor Mallard, his story brought the island of Niue together. He also put the small island into international news, serving as an ambassador for Niue and raising awareness of this unique island nation. And that's it for today's video. Which story did you find the most interesting? And what other stories have you heard in the news? I want to thank my patrons, Kasha, Lael, April, and Colby. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. And if you want to become a patron, check out the link in the video description below. And before you go, help me out with a like and a comment. And if you enjoyed the video, maybe consider subscribing. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.